When Ulrik Plesner suggested that he would rather be interviewed and not bore the audience with his usual lecture, after much urging by him, I suggested I would do it. So with backing and support from Nazreen and Dominic, this seems to be the better choice. I must also thank the staff of Barefoot for all the wonderful arrangements to make this an enjoyable evening. Also the firm of Prakash Merchandani of Favorite International for the sparkling wine to enliven this evening. I've known Ulrik Plesner and his family for 4 generations. From 1961, we have been in touch with each other for almost 50 years. That's many more years than most of you have been around. I've collaborated with on several projects, commencing with the documentary of architecture and building of the 16th, 19th century of Sri Lanka, and in culminating an exhibition in 2008 February at the Goethe Center, an assessment of his contribution to architecture and education in Sri Lanka. It is an amazing coincidence that at the German Cultural Center that Ulrik had his exhibition for Donald's friend in the 1960s. To those who are hardly aware of Ulrik Plesner's contribution, here are some details. Born in Italy in 1930, he graduated as architect from the Royal Danish Academy in 1955 and arrived in Sri Lanka at the invitation of Minette de Silva, who was the first Asian woman of the RIBA. Offered by Jon Utzon a post as site architect at the Opera House, Sydney, he turned it down. After almost a year with Minette, he befriended Jeffrey Bava, and they both had almost 9 years of fruitful collaboration. In 1967, he left Sri Lanka and after a stint in London and Israel, returned to Sri Lanka in 1987 and have been working in Israel since then, but is as much decorated by the Danish as well as the Sri Lankan Institute of Architects. So, Ulrik, okay, do we need to knock any of these lights off? No. Fine? Okay. This is, you can see the image here, right? This is Clint, your stepfather, and could you tell the audience something about your childhood and to the point of getting, how and why you wanted to be an architect?
I'll make it short. Clint was my stepfather. I come from a family of architects. My grandfather's brother was a well-known architect at the turn of the century, national romantic, returning to the roots and all that kind of thing. And then later on, when my father died, my mother got involved with Clint, who was quite an important architect in Denmark. So I grew up in the atmosphere, and we went to Italy a lot, where I got involved with Roman Catholic priests who were architects, and I learned about what was important in a building, I think, and had a very nice. I have no complaints about my childhood. I had a very happy childhood, and my mother was Scottish, and I got to know a lot of English and Scottish country houses and castles through my grandparents who lived in a country house. So I grew up in this whole culture of fabulous homes with spaces that were beautiful, and then I knew that what matters in a building is how it relates to people, not the shapes, not the sensations, but the human content of a building.
These are 2 chairs by Clint, which are still being manufactured. This last safari chair, there was a firm which we used to manufacture it and sell it to Ulrik and Jeffrey, and we used to have it in some of the hotels here. It's called the safari chair, and it's a very, very practical chair, foldable. Now we come to this part of Ulrik's education at the Royal Danish Academy and in Copenhagen. That's an engraving of 1741 when it was founded. And this is the interior of the library, and that's where we used to come in at the main entrance. Sorry. And so, Ulrik, you went to study the RDA, the Royal Danish Academy, from 1949 to 55. You graduated in 55, right? And which I was to follow in your footsteps a decade later. But even in 1966, it was compulsory and obligatory that a student enrolling in the School of Architecture underwent a comprehensive course of site work, either in one of the building trades, right? Bricklaying, carpentry, or plumbing. To me, it sounded sometimes like that. Would it be, if you wanted to be a mature violinist like Yehudi Menuhin or David Oistrakh, do you need to be able to make a violin? And then, what was the whole point of the academy having this strict?
The point was that architecture grows out of the building crafts. I mean, to be an architect, you have to know how to be a carpenter, how to do window details, make a roof that doesn't leak, how to move brickwork, how to do stonework, how to do the problems of foundations, the problems of installations, and now problems of electricity and all that. And architecture schools have now become so concerned with images and icons that also in Israel, and I'm sure most other places, the architects forget the contact to the ground, and they do buildings which don't work.
Okay.
And they give themselves a bad name, and they give the profession a bad name. That's me as a bricklayer when I was 23.
That's Alvar Aalto and his wife. That's the church he did in Helsinki, a detail of his. And that's Johan Utzon. And behind him is the Opera House. And that's the Opera House itself. This is one of the houses he built, his own house. And that's Le Corbusier. Now what I want to find out is that in the book, I can't use a more elegant word, but a harsh word, that you trash all these architects and you say that, the work, and then there is also Louis Kahn. I'll show you his work a little later, but Louis Kahn. And you have had obviously personal experience in visiting these buildings done by them in Chandigarh, in the case of Le Corbusier, Louis Kahn in Tel Aviv, Utzon, or his own work in Denmark. And so what I want to know is why you've been so discouraged and,
Well, the problem is that many of them are great artists, but they have completely lost touch with the reality of the reality that gives life to a building. I mean, the human demand that gives life to a building, to be a home or to be a museum or a school or something, that is what matters. And many of these so-called icon buildings are terrible examples of each of their kind. I mean, the Guggenheim in New York is a bad museum, this one, that spiral. The Guggenheim in Bilbao is also not a very good museum. The Sydney Opera House is a bad opera house. And all these icons, they pay a great price for the people who use them and live in them and pay for them. And now architects, because they're driven by publicity and all that, all over Asia, particularly in China, they build buildings which are completely weird shapes that you have nothing to do with the life that goes on inside them. And I think they're driven by the magazines and by publicity, PR.
Yeah, because I mentioned, last evening you were mentioning that you'd been to Louis Kahn's building in Philadelphia, but I met him in his own office. He was very sweet, very nice, gave us a chair, took out his own letterhead and wrote out a long letter to visit all his sites. And this one at the Salk Institute on the west coast near San Diego was very impressive. Maybe I was, as a young architect, impressionable. But you say that you've been in one or two of his buildings.
I've been in some of his buildings, yes.
Yeah.
And they were very unpleasant. The people who lived in them, they hated them because he put concrete walls in front of the building as if to create some. But I mean, it was just it blocked the view and it blocked the free ventilation of air. So they just hated them.
And I think his building in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, also came under some severe criticism.
I haven't been there, but I'm sure it is.
So Minette De Silva, our first Asian woman RIBA, and
I want to say a good word about Minette.
Yeah.
When she somehow through a mutual friend got in touch with me and asked me to come out because she'd seen a Buddha monument that I had done in an international competition. I was told by the foremost American architecture photographer, Kidder Smith, that she was the only progressive architect in Asia. And when I came out, I found that was true. All the rest of Asia had a kind of damp cloth all over it architecturally. It was all British Empire, like the town hall here, which is a good and all the buildings in the harbour, and in Singapore, in Hong Kong, it was all the same story. British Public Works Department stuff. And Minette really tried to break it. It was too much for this fragile little woman, but that's another story.
So that's Mr. Plesner in his 1937, right? Fear, right?
That's correct.
Right?
In Kandy, you can see the
there was
Temple
only
of
one other
Truth
car which belonged to the Duke of Edinburgh or something, right?
That's also right. And Oliver Gudetrekker once waved to me because he thought I was the Duke of Edinburgh.
And that's Ulrik Plesner in the office we worked in, and that's Edward Riedenbeck, now Paradise Road Restaurant. And that's Mr. Bava in the background, Jeffrey Bava and Ulrik. Ulrik belongs to the blueprint generation and also the T-square and the drawing board, because now we've all, I'm not very good at computers, but you probably are the last of the Renaissance architects who used a T-square and a drawing board. You still use it, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And everybody comes in and is amazed. They say it's fantastic. Yeah. But the fact is that in many architecture schools now in Europe, they're going back and saying the 2-3 first years you're not allowed to use computers because computers demand artificial precision of millimeters at even at the early conceptual stages, and you can't think conceptually in a precision of millimeters. And they find that it actually becomes a prevention for creative thinking.
So,
but I mean, in that case, I must also say, Jeffrey, he was a very superior guy. He was a great guy and a very intelligent guy, and like everybody else, I liked him enormously, and he was extremely amusing, and we clicked from the first moment. But he was damaged by an incredibly pampered childhood. He grew up in a well-off family. He had, from the age of 7, he had his own personal servant at age 7. His father brought a Tamil boy from South India and gave it to him. They were both age 7. And Jeffrey and his servant Miguel grew up together. And Miguel lived to be 65 when he died of cancer here in Durden's hospital. And I went to visit him. And Miguel said to me, "Sorry, sir, soon no more servant." He apologized for dying. And that was the spirit. And so Jeffrey grew up with this, not being able to lift a piece of paper off the floor. And I mention this not negatively because I think all the Sri Lankans here know this syndrome from the maybe 50, 60 years past. I'm sure it's not like that anymore. But that's how some of them grew up. And he could not handle the daily instruments of his of architecture. He couldn't do a T-square, he couldn't do a triangle, and I felt I'd met a great musician, Beethoven, who couldn't play an instrument. So I decided myself to teach him, and for 2 or 3 years I put him through an architecture school, and from that our friendship strengthened and became very strong and very effective. In the end we were interchangeable.
So here's a building which you seem to have enunciated the first important Newtonian law that a roof is the main thing. You know, that's the Anuradhapura house, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was the first house where we discovered that we were on wrong. That was after we went to Chandigarh, and we saw what a disaster Corbusier had created in Chandigarh there, in terms of not relating to the climate, to the weather, to the way of people's life, to the Indian traditions, to nothing. And everybody's going around unhappily there, dying of heat and dust. So when we came back, we said something is wrong. And that's when we did. And then we did this little house in Anuradhapura with a big roof, and when we saw it, we said, that's it. The roof is the answer is the key to everything. And from then on, we knew where we were going.
That's a section of the house belonging to Malkanti and Maurice Pereira. I think they are here somewhere. I'm sorry, the image is small, but that's you can look back probably and see the
plans. Yes.
Yeah, right. And that's Ian Pierce's house, Ian and Goon Pierce's house in Barnes Place, elevation from the road. And that's you working at your concrete desk at Edwards Reed and Begg. So this is an interesting photograph below the sketch of the Bandaravala church. Barbara is on the right of you, or left, I can't, that side, and you at the site, and the building has just started, got beyond the foundation stage, and to all the doubting Thomases that you've been in control of this building. I'd just like to know whether this has some Nordic Scandinavian influence in the interior of the churches that we saw in Finland and Norway and Sweden. You know, I mean, it was open, you could see the rolling countryside, tropical countryside, but still there had some element of, you know, Nordic design. Would you have any comments about?
I can't tell you, but I think at the time I thought it was a Ceylonese church, a small Ceylonese church like the bit, but not in colonial style in our time, and with the daylight, using the daylight as a spiritual element, with the daylight coming down through the tower, a glass tower, down onto the altar, and the only light, the other light in the room from a north-lit, very low north-lit window looking over the valley, and the 3 big crucifixes of Golgotha. I must add that I'm not a Christian. I denounced my religion many years ago, and I denounce most religions, and but this was done for such a wonderful woman who was the mother of Provincial and a very good friend of Barbara Sansoni's. So we did this church together, myself and Barbara Sansoni and Jeffrey Bauer, and Lucky Senenaik also joined in and did the vestments, and it was what is in the old days was called a Gesamtkunstwerk, a united work of art.
That is the house in Maskelia for the planter, I think George Stewart's house in Maskelia with
the manager's house for the estate.
Yeah.
Stadsby.
Stadsby, yeah, on the slopes of Adams Peak, yeah.
I have to add a little note that the hill behind it, you see, the house was built closer to it, the foundations were cut, and when we cut the foundations, I got a phone call in Colombo saying, come up quickly, and I came up and they found that they had cut and they were there were garnets and other semi-precious stones pouring out of the hill. So we moved the building about 100 yards, and I got so 2 huge handfuls of semi-precious stones to take home as my part of the share. And when Jeffrey, who at that moment was abroad in Mexico, when he came back, I gave him 1 handful. And that's when he convinced his partner Nilgiria to make me a partner.
This is Polomtalava, the wilderness of the dry zone. And how did you work on that? I mean, did Jeffrey visit the site often as you did, or did you?
Polomtalava was Bauer and Company. I suppose they're still here.
Yeah, they're still here.
They owned 1,000 acres of scrub jungle up near inland from Chilao, inland from no, not Chilao.
Yeah, it's Chilao. Yeah,
inland from Chilao, and we turned it into a coconut estate, and wanted an office and so I went up there and walked and on foot and on jeep and an elephant back all over the 1,000 acres, and found a wonderful place with huge round rocks, which had been, some of them had been split in prehistoric ages. There were split marks of, as you know, with little teeth. And we placed the house there, but you couldn't make a drawing because it was too uneven. And so I went back, I did a sketch, and then I went back with Jeffrey, and we set the whole thing out in little white strings, and there was a leopard kitten that kept running after us. But it was set out in white, and for a year the strings were there. The whole shape of the house was there in strings, and the jungle villagers who built the house were told to build up to here, build up to there, and bring the materials. And once a week or once in 2 weeks, I came back, and sometimes Jeffrey also. We did everything. Everything we did, we agreed on beforehand, and then one of us took it over, and the other came every now and then and visited. I visited his stuff, and he visited my stuff, and it worked out very nicely.
This was the era of the documentation of 16th to 19th century, the old buildings, which I think Lucky is here and Barbara is away. The 4 of us measured together, starting from Pardenia and going through to, Carpetia, and I think there were about a dozen buildings.
That was a very exciting time, because I realized, and we realized, I mean, when I say there was a whole group of people. It's not a I business. There was Jeffrey, and there was and myself, and a whole group of very talented and spirited architects and artists, Barbara Sansoni, Lucky Senanaike, Ismet Rahim, Feroz Choksi, Lucky Senanaike, and others, and it was an enthusiastic group of people. My only difference was I had a little a professional background that was of help sometimes. But we found all these beautiful old buildings that nobody cared about. This temple in Pardenia, we went in there, the priest said he wanted to pull it down because it was shameful. It was in a bit bad condition. And build something with vinyl floors and American roofs like this. And so Barbara gave him a long lecture on his responsibility to his culture, and Lucky lectured him on Buddhism, and the poor man was completely overwhelmed. And so then the next week we came back and measured it up again, and it's now in Barbara's book on the island, which took many years to publish. We had a lot of trouble getting all this work published, but in the end Barbara succeeded.
So now we come to the contentious thing, which I want to jog your memory. This is the work of the Mexican architect Luis Barragan. The chair that you see in the foreground is something that has been in Sri Lanka for 150 years. I've managed to date it back to colored drawing of the GS house in Kandy by Hippolyte Silva. So this chair, probably a colonial period chair, but it came with the arms. Most of the drawings of 1850 to 1900 shows the curly arms on it. And then we used the model very much without the arms at Bentota Beach. And I wonder whether, Louis Barragan's work, echoed in, subsequently in the work that was carried on in Edward Wiedenbeck, or whether these are some of the images, and he built masonry, beds, tables, concrete things, pools, raised pools, and he had a huge influence because he spent 3 or 4 years or more in Europe, and he was heavily influenced by Le Corbusier's work, but he came back and, like you did or all of us do, tried to re-synthesize the work. Can you say anything about the influence of his work? Whether there was, because Jeffrey was in Mexico in 1959, 60, so like you said. So does that have any, significance in the work that was being carried out here?
I don't remember Jeffrey ever talking about Louis Barragan, and I don't remember him talking about having seen his work in Mexico. So I can't tell you. And the truth is, we were not a bit academic. We were not really interested in what went on in the rest of the world. We were simply so in depth of what was going on here around us, and enjoying ourselves with our friends, and like Anu Ratnavibhushana and clients. There were so many amusing clients like Enu Jayawardena and Ina de Silva and Barbara also as a client, and there was a whole world of Sri Lanka had a completely crazy, zany middle class at the time, which was absolutely wonderful, and we just lived as part of that with very little thought of what was going on outside until in the end.
So this is Donald Friend, right? The Australian painter who was here, who befriended Bevis and stayed at Bevis's house, and probably the first large mural that was done by him was done at Bowles, and from his diary we knew that from June 1960 he completed it all for 1,000 rupees.
That's great.
For Theodore Hoffman was partly engineered it. Here's the original cartoon from what is on the wall of Bar's building. It's slightly damaged now and there's a crack appearing on it. But this is the one I think you had persuaded him to do at McKinnon's.
That's right.
The one on Colombo. This one is Colombo because it shows all the brokers bidding for the tea and so on.
Yeah, but the big building is Gold Fort, Gold Harbour.
No, the one above, he did two. Sorry, this one is Colombo. He did one for Gaul as well. McKinnon's. There were
right,
two,
right.
And then you held an exhibition for him and challenged Plesner, saying, now you always using gold and all this sort of very rich material. Why don't you use simple material like sort of everyday material like utility material like aluminium? And these were one or two of the sculptures he did, which was at the German Cultural Institute. Personally, I don't know whether Lucky will agree, but I found that he was an excellent draftsman. He's probably Australia's best draftsman, probably equal to anyone. But between being a draftsman and being a painter, there's a huge leap. And I really don't know whether he really made that gulf. What's your opinion about that?
I loved his work. I loved both his aluminium stuff and his paintings, because everything was done with such a living into it. I mean, he saw some fishermen in Berowella, and he'd completely be grabbed by their whole way of life and their movements and their boats and everything. I think he was a great guy. He drank a lot, he loved a lot, he made good friends, he was a great guy with all the young artists like Lucky and Narasimham and some of the other ones. And I think that some of them found themselves through his work. He gave as much as he got, and that's saying a lot. A lot of people come and take and take and take and don't give. He gave.
Well, this is something it's a sort of distraction. This is what I wrote to you about. We were all struggling to do 20-foot, beam and columns, 20-foot span and so on. And when you look back into the history of Sri Lanka, both colonial and historic architecture, you see some of the most amazing things that have happened. This bridge, made out of satin wood, and each piece was only 3 feet long. It was 4 by 4. It was not nailed, it was all latched on, so that if there's a termite attack, you could dismantle, you go into the ribs of the building. You can see much more, And it spanned the Mahaveli at Peradeniya, 205 feet. It's an incredible span, right? And it was all done by 2 young military Royal Engineers. It was all constructed at the Golf Face Green. Governor Barnes was in charge. He got 5 elephants, loaded the bridge, checked it out to see that it won't collapse, dismantled, and the abutments were built, and in 1.5 years the bridge was thrown across. It served 85 years till motorized traffic came into Sri Lanka, and it was unfortunately it was thought unsafe, and the bridge was brought down. But by that time, coffee had been devastated, tea had been grown, at least there was no motorized traffic, so about 1 million carts had crossed the bridge. So the bridge withstood 85 years of use, right? And at the end, what happened was that when the bridge was taken down, some sensible person in the Royal Engineers used the timber, part of the timber work, and did a 10-foot model of the bridge, and it's at the Science Museum in London, made out of the original satin wood. So it just shows that sometimes, you have all these fantastic engineers and architects, and you see these 2, 35-year-old Royal Engineers tackling an enormous project like this, right? Quite
amazing. So may I just add, as a contrast, the bridge over the River Kwai, it was built in wood, as we all know, and it had this sort of shape like the famous Firth of Forth Bridge in Scotland, with a kind of cantilever tower, which is a steel bridge, which is steel design. And of course, it can't be wood design because wood can't take tension. Because if you had tension in a wood joint, it would just come apart. Wood can only take compression. So I asked its chief engineer, who was a Danish architect from an Danish Indian firm. That was my first contact when I came to Colombo. I asked him, what about that? He said he was right. We were right. They lost a hell of a lot of money on that bridge. They had to put a whole secret steel construction inside it before the train could go out on it. That's bridges.
And this is someone who you missed out in your memoir. This is the work of Lionel Wen, and I just want to show you. He died in 1944, but 10 years before that, he had this incredible, mind and organizing spaces. His own house, which is the Spanish, he called it white walls, and it's completely white interior with hanging saris and black and white photographs of it, and it's very architectural. It's very Italian yet futuristic. Most of the photography he did of architecture, and this is just to show you what went on before you came to Sri Lanka. And this is just a sort of thing to tease the mind of. And this other one is what I asked you the last time you were here. It's the house and the printing press of Ananda Kumaraswamy in Norman Chapel in Gloucestershire, where he did this medieval Sinhalese art book, which I was trying to persuade you to read, because it has all the synthesis of Kandyan architecture. And he bought William Morris's press and hand printed the book, 450 copies. And I was wondering how you missed out on,
I didn't miss out. I have the book. I got the book in 1960. But I found it was mostly about decorative art, not about architecture.
Right. That's
Sorry.
a good answer. And talking about masonry, seats and so on, there are some 80 examples of fantastic rock-built seats in Sigiriya, in Rajangana. This is in Sigiriya, overlooking the cliff edge. This is in Rajangana. And it will be a lucky, ideal thing for you to turn out, 4 years for a seat shipped out of door. And that's an interior of a cell in. And so we come to your Mahaveli program. And could you tell us something about this, as well? I mean, what you did and in the 7-8 years you worked on the Mahaveli?
Yeah, that's a sad story. I came back in the 80s and met Kamini Dissanayake, who asked me to, they'd already started with the Mahaveli project, which was of course a great and wonderful thing. And so I'll make a very long story short. We set up a whole office up in Kandy with about 75 people and a whole department by itself, responsible directly to the minister, and he was very interested, and started planning and building 6 or 7 towns: Velikanda, Dehiatakandya, Girandarukote, and several others. But then, as we know, Kamini was assassinated, and the whole thing the whole energy for that place, as far as I could see, came from Kamini. Because the minute, that was seen from my point of view, the minute he was gone, there was no energy behind it, and it was such a huge machine with spending so much World Bank and other money that it just petered out. And as far as I can see, most of the paddy is there, but the towns have never come middle class. And then, of course, came the Civil War that also ruined it, because no middle class people will go up and live in one of these new towns as doctors or teachers or nurses or shopkeepers. So that the whole thing, I don't even know where it stands today. But I spent 7 years of my life there.
Dominic, behind.
Who?
No, I just wanted Dominic's advice. Dom, can I just ask you? Right. This is going nostalgic. The last one has a little note under it. Is there some way I can recover the... This is an exhibition that we held in Denmark when we were students for Barbara Sanzoni, and Ulrik's brother Erling had a bevy of girlfriends who were working SAS when he used to work there, and we had these models to come and dress themselves up, and we took these photographs of, and then got them published in the newspaper, and had very good reviews and managed to make something like 30,000 Danish kroner. And we did the same thing for the very bad photograph, very poor photograph. That's Anura, myself, and Vasanta in the background. Vasanta is in the foreground, and of the same exhibition held for Ina de Silva at the tea center along the walking street. And so I end this last distinct of Erik Brun, because the architecture school, right next to it was a ballet school, and right next to it was a ceramic school and etching. So I used to go through, in the evening doing engravings and, printing, and then we used to get into the ballet school, and often we used to see the Royal Danish Ballet in action because we were students, we were allowed free entry. And we used to, once in a while, see Erik Brun coming in, and he was considered by Balshanov and, Rudolf Nureyev to be the greatest male dancer. So this is what he says about partnership, dancing with a ballerina. It has been noticed that I have been able to work with many different kinds of ballerinas, and on most occasions we succeeded in becoming a team, if only for a season. And that is because I always wanted to relate to them. I don't remain the same. Each ballerina is different. She has a special flavor, or she wouldn't be a ballerina. That would color my style and shape my approach. I remain true to myself by I left her flavor color me as mine colors her. A good partnership can sometimes somehow crystallize something that you have been doing already. When the right people come together, they bring the right thing out of each other. With the right person, it becomes a situation of being rather than playing. That's what he said, and that's, I think, what Ulrik and Jeffrey did in their course of their years here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ulrik.